The blood still dripped from the stones as the last screams died away in the castle Drakon. It was a cold December morning in 1610, and the vapor rising from the ground wasn't just the soldier's breath, it was the stench of horror unearthed from the fortress's deepest dungeons. Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, had finally been captured. But what they found there transcended any nightmare the human mind could conceive. 46 years earlier, Elizabeth was born into one of Hungary's most powerful families. Castle Exed witnessed her first cry, but even then, a dark shadow loomed over the child. Her uncle, Stephen Bathory, was king of Poland. Her cousin, Sigismund, Prince of Transylvania. Noble blood ran thick in her veins, but with it, something older and more sinister also manifested. From her earliest years, Elizabeth displayed a morbid fascination with others' pain. She'd tear the wings off butterflies with a blood-chilling smile, and watch with bright eyes as servants were whipped for minor infractions. At 15, she married Ferenc Nadasdy, known as the Black Knight, a man whose reputation for cruelty on the battlefields was legendary. Castle Drakon became her new residence, a Gothic fortress that seemed sculpted from darkness itself. The towers rose like skeletal fingers against the gray sky, and the corridors echoed with a bone-chilling coldness. It was the perfect setting for the transformation to come. During her early years of marriage, Elizabeth seemed like a typical noblewoman. She hosted lavish parties, received foreign dignitaries, and oversaw the family's vast estates. But when Ferenc left for his military campaigns, something darker emerged. Servants began whispering about excessively cruel punishments for minor offenses. A maid who dropped a glass of wine was found days later with burn marks forming deliberate patterns on her skin. Another, who had laughed too loudly during a meal, vanished completely, leaving only bloodstains on the stone floor of her chamber. The true transformation began after Ferenc's death in 1604. Widowed at 44, Elizabeth found herself with absolute power over her lands and a freedom she'd never known. That's when the most sinister rumors began to circulate. Merchants passing through the region spoke of screams lasting all night, emanating from the depths of the castle. Villagers reported that young peasant girls summoned to serve at the castle never returned to their families. What truly happened in the secret chambers of Castle Drakon was a gradual, methodical descent from sanity into utter madness. Elizabeth had developed a pathological obsession with youth and beauty, fueled by a growing paranoia about her own aging. Every wrinkle that appeared on her face, every strand of hair that grayed, every sign that time was passing, ignited a fury that found its outlet in the systematic torture of young women. He was a predator who had learned to interpret every gesture, every glance, every word as a potential threat to his supremacy. Henry's paranoia had become so intense that he began to see patterns where none existed. When Anne spoke with court musicians, he saw seduction. When she laughed at a joke, he saw disrespect. When she was absent from a public event, he saw conspiracy. Cromwell, ever attentive to the shifts in the royal mood, began preparing the ground for the Queen's downfall. Not out of personal malice, but out of a survival instinct that told him Henry's mind had already condemned Anne. All that remained was to find the evidence. If you've been following these accounts of history's darker aspects of human nature, consider subscribing to the channel to continue receiving narratives that explore the depths of the human psyche and the most intense moments of our collective journey. Anne Boleyn's trial was a sham, revealing the extent of Henry's mental deterioration. The accusations were based on paranoid interpretations of everyday events. A conversation with a musician became adultery. A dropped handkerchief became a coded signal. A smile became evidence of conspiracy. Henry didn't need real evidence. He had constructed an alternate reality where Anne was guilty simply for failing to meet his megalomaniacal expectations. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Henry's paranoia was its ability to infect others. Courtiers who had been close friends with Anne began fabricating evidence against her, fearing their loyalty would be interpreted as complicity. Servants who had adored her began reporting conversations that never happened. Even her own sister provided testimony that could be incriminating. The king's paranoia had become contagious, transforming the entire court into a web of suspicion and betrayal. On the eve of her execution, Anne Boleyn wrote a letter to Henry that was never delivered, but preserved by one of her servants. In it, she wrote, "Your Majesty has created a world where love has become a crime, where loyalty has become treason, where truth has become heresy. I die not for betraying you, but for loving you when you were no longer capable of love." Anne's execution didn't bring Henry peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of a downward spiral that consumed him for the next 11 years. His third wife, Jane Seymour, gave him the longed-for son, but died in childbirth. Henry interpreted this as divine punishment, not for his cruelties, but for his excessive mercy towards his enemies. Paranoia had become his primary lens for understanding the world. Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, was quickly dismissed when Henry decided she'd been sent by foreign enemies to humiliate him. He couldn't accept that he simply wasn't attracted to her. In his warped mind, a lack of desire could only be explained by a conspiracy to render him impotent through witchcraft. Anne, a pragmatic and intelligent woman, accepted the annulment with relief, realizing she'd escaped a terrible fate. Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, was perhaps the most tragic victim of Henry's paranoia. Young, vivacious, and genuinely in love with the king, she made the imprudence of maintaining correspondence with a former suitor. When Henry discovered the letters, his reaction was apocalyptic. He didn't see a young woman indulging in nostalgia, but a traitor who'd conspired against him from the start. Catherine was executed in 1542, but not before Henry ordered the torture of dozens of people who might have had any connection to her. Henry VIII's final years were marked by paranoia so intense it bordered on madness. He had become physically monstrous. His once athletic body was swollen and covered in festering sores that emitted a putrid odor. His legs were so inflamed he could no longer walk, being carried in a special chair that groaned under his weight. But his mind had become even more deformed than his body. Catherine Parr, his last wife, survived only because she learned to navigate Henry's paranoia with the skill of a diplomat. She never expressed her own opinions, never questioned her decisions, never showed interest in other men. She transformed herself into a mirror that reflected only what Henry wanted to see, and even then lived in constant terror that a misunderstood word could send her to the scaffold. The king had become a prisoner in his own palaces. He couldn't trust no one, couldn't relax for a moment, couldn't find peace even in sleep. His chambers were locked with 7 different keys, each guarded by a different servant. He slept with a dagger under his pillow and woke several times during the night, convinced he heard footsteps approaching. His cries of terror in the dead of night became so common that the servants learned to ignore them. Henry's body began to fail in the same proportion as his mind. The ulcers on his legs spread throughout his body, creating wounds that never healed. His physicians, too terrified to deliver bad news, invented increasingly elaborate and useless treatments. Leeches, alchemic potions, mass prayers. Everything was tried, but nothing could cure a man who had poisoned himself with his own paranoia.
Henry's paranoia no longer limited itself to individuals. It had expanded to encompass entire nations. He saw French conspiracies in every embassy, Spanish intrigues in every trade deal, Scottish treachery in every troop movement on the borders. His ministers learned to fabricate evidence of external threats to keep the king focused on distant enemies instead of looking for traitors among them. Thomas Cromwell, who had been his most effective instrument in the destruction of Anne Boleyn, eventually became a victim of the same paranoia he had helped to fuel. When the marriage he arranged with Anne of Cleves proved a disaster, Henry came to see him not as a loyal servant who had made a mistake, but as a traitor who had conspired to humiliate him. Cromwell was executed in 1540, protesting his innocence to the end. But Henry had already rewritten history to transform decades of loyal service into evidence of long-standing treachery. Henry's physical deterioration was impossible to hide. Foreign ambassadors who visited him left shocked by his appearance. The man once considered the most handsome prince in Europe had become a grotesque caricature of himself. His face was swollen and red, his small, suspicious eyes seemed always searching for invisible threats. His breathing was labored and fetid, forced through lungs struggling against the weight of his ravaged body. But it was his mind that had become truly terrifying. Henry developed the ability to completely rewrite his own history, always transforming himself into the hero of each narrative. Anne Boleyn hadn't been a woman he had loved and then destroyed. She had been a seductress who had deceived him from the beginning.
This self-harm gradually intensified, evolving into more serious injuries that frequently became infected due to the unsanitary conditions of her imprisonment. The last months of Elizabeth's life were marked by a dramatic acceleration of her deterioration. She stopped eating regularly, insisting that her friends provided her with all the necessary nourishment. Her body, already extremely weakened, began to show signs of severe malnutrition. Her hair began to fall out in clumps, leaving bald patches that she obsessively covered with scraps of fabric torn from her dresses. Simultaneously, her vocalizations intensified. Elizabeth developed a kind of private language, a mixture of distorted Hungarian, liturgical Latin, and sounds that seemed to have no human origin. She conversed in this language for hours, gesturing animatedly as if conducting a complex social gathering. The guards reported that sometimes they could swear they heard other voices responding, young female voices whispering replies that made Elizabeth laugh with a disturbing glee. Death arrived silently in the early morning of August 21, 1614. Elizabeth was found lying in the center of her cell, her arms outstretched in a position resembling a crucifixion. Her eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, and her lips curved into a blood-chilling smile that froze the guard who discovered her. Around her body, scratched into the stone floor, were dozens of women's names, the same names she had obsessively repeated during years of confinement. Father Andrew, summoned to administer the last rites, encountered a scene that haunted him for the rest of his life. Elizabeth had apparently died peacefully, but there was something profoundly disturbing about the expression on her face. It wasn't the peace of redemption or repentance, but a deep and sinister satisfaction, as if she had finally found something she had sought her entire life. Even more unsettling were the conditions of the cell. Although Elizabeth had been confined alone for 4 years, there were clear signs that she had not died in solitude. Small personal items, a broken comb, strands of blonde hair, fragments of fine fabric, were scattered around the cell, items that did not belong to Elizabeth and that no one could explain how they had gotten there. Elizabeth's body was secretly buried in an unmarked grave at the church of Castle Drakon, but even in death she continued to haunt the region. In the weeks following the burial, dozens of young women in the area reported vivid dreams in which Elizabeth appeared, inviting them to play at her old castle.
Some of these women were found dead under mysterious circumstances, with injuries reminiscent of the Countess's favorite methods of torture. Castle Drakon was officially abandoned, but never truly empty. Travelers passing through the region for decades reported strange lights in the towers, screams echoing on windless nights, and female figures walking the ramparts. The locals developed a series of rituals and superstitions to protect themselves from what they considered to be Elizabeth's persistent influence. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Elizabeth Bathory's legacy is not the supernatural, but the profoundly human. Her actions revealed a capacity for evil that transcends any simple explanation of madness or demonic possession. Elizabeth was an intelligent, educated, politically astute, and socially connected woman who deliberately chose a path of extreme cruelty. She was not a victim of circumstance or manipulation. She was the conscious architect of horrors that defy human comprehension. Her crimes expose the fragility of the moral and legal systems that supposedly protect the innocent. For decades, Elizabeth operated with complete impunity, protected by her social position and the complacency of a society that preferred to ignore the screams coming from her castle. She revealed how absolute power can corrupt not only those who wield it, but also those who allow it to be wielded without question. The sexual dimension of her crimes adds an extra layer of disturbing depravity. Elizabeth didn't torture for politics, religion, or even material gain. She tortured for sexual pleasure. Her crimes revealed a form of sadism that transcends any known category of psychological deviancy, a fusion of power, sexuality, and death that created a uniquely terrifying psychological dynamic. Elizabeth Bathory remains a grim reminder that the truest monsters are those who walk among us with human faces, who speak our languages and share our institutions. She forces us to confront the possibility that the capacity for absolute evil may reside in any of us, waiting only for the right circumstances to manifest. Her story isn't just about a woman who killed hundreds. It's about a society that allowed it to happen, and about the human nature that makes such horrors possible. In the end, Elizabeth Bathory achieved a form of immortality, but not the one she desired. She didn't conquer eternal youth through the blood of her victims, but she achieved a different eternity, the eternity of memory, where she remains forever a symbol of humanity's capacity for absolute evil. Her story continues to resonate through the centuries, reminding us that some horrors are too deep to be buried, and that the true nature of evil is that it can wear any face, even the most beautiful.